Welcome back, my gardening friends, to another Focal Point Friday episode. Let's spend just a few minutes together reviewing a snippet of information from a previous episode, highlighting a new topic, or quickly focusing on a current event in the food and agriculture world. Let's get down and dirty. How do you transition your plants into your garden space? This isn't just simply take the plants out of where you started your seedlings and put them in their garden home. It's also not a matter of bringing home plants from the nursery or the farmer's market and putting them straight into their containers, whether you're gardening outside or inside. Your plants need to get acclimated to their new growing space. The first thing we need to talk about is hardening off. I first talked about this way back in episode 8 of the podcast, and it's been mentioned numerous times along the way ever since. Essentially, if you started your plants early indoors, you'll need to prepare them for the outdoors. Doing this properly will thicken the cuticle on the leaves so that they lose less water when exposed to the elements. It'll strengthen the stems against wind damage, cause the plant to be more temperature hardy, and will prevent transplant shock, which can cause plant growth to completely stall out or even cause plants to die from the sudden change in temperature and sun exposure. To harden off a seedling, start by gradually reducing the amount of water it receives over the course of the week before you transplant, especially if you don't irrigate your garden regularly. Let them dry out between watering to simulate those conditions. On days when the temperatures are warm, put the plants outside in a protected area outside of direct sunlight for a few hours the first day, and then add a couple of hours to that the next day. This is not only exposing them to increased amounts of sunlight, but also to wind and other elements. If there isn't enough air movement on the days that you've got the plants outside, run your hands across the plants several times a day or put them in front of a fan or something. That'll also do the trick. Now, after a few days, you can place them in the direct morning sun, moving them to the shade or back indoors for the afternoons, and then gradually expose them to more direct sun each day. Within about 5 to 7 days, your plants should be used to the outdoor temperatures and the elements. Their final test is to place them, still in their containers, out into the place where they will reside permanently and leave them for 24 hours. If they still look good, well then go forth and plant, my friend. But if they show any signs of stress or shock along the way with this process, slow your roll and introduce them more gradually. What are those signs of stress? Things like very wilted plants or sagging leaves that don't seem to perk back up again, spots on the leaves that look like burn marks, discolored leaves, leaves dropping off the plant, plants that lean over and don't seem to stand back up very readily, especially after being watered or when having heavy wind gusts. These are all signs that your plants need to be acclimated a little bit more slowly. You are much better off delaying your planting by a week or so than transplanting on the schedule that you've set for yourself only to shock your plants and have it set your harvest back by a full month or more. Or worse, not getting a harvest at all because the plants die and now you have to go buy replacement plants. Now, just because you buy plants from the store or the market instead of starting them yourself doesn't mean you get to skip this hardening off process. Purchased plants might be hardened off to the best of the grower's ability before being sold to you, and they might not be. Whether or not a purchased plant has been hardened off at all prior to your purchase, the conditions at the greenhouse or the farm those plants came from are not the same as the ones in your garden. And if they've been hardened off to some extent, those plants have likely been hardened off as a group, not individual plants facing the outdoor conditions alone. This makes a difference. If you have a tray of like 18 to 30 plants sitting together outside facing the wind, for example, and they're set next to a bunch of other trays of 18 to 30 plants, they've got each other for support and a little bit of protection. That's very different from a single plant whose nearest neighbor is 18 to 36 inches away. So while you don't have to take the entire week to harden them off, you should give them a few days to acclimate to your unique gardening situation. If you're gardening outdoors, put the plants out into the sun for a few morning hours the first day after you bring them home, and then back into the shade in the afternoon. Increase those hours the next 2 days and then give them that 24-hour test on day 4. You should also be letting them dry out between waterings each day to acclimate them to less than ideal conditions. Taking those few days to get them ready for the garden will pay off, trust me. Keep an eye out for those stress indicators I talked about earlier and adjust your schedule accordingly. Now, if you're an indoor grower, pay attention to the conditions the plants were in when you bought them. If you're buying from a box store or a nursery, look around at where the plants are located. If they're in the indoor area of the store, they may have only had artificial lighting for like 18 hours a day. They can likely easily transition to your indoor space, but be sure to keep your lights up higher from the plants than you might think. If they've only had overhead lighting from the store 15 feet up at the ceiling level, you'll shock them by suddenly putting them under lights that are only 6 inches above the leaf surface. Introduce them gradually. Now, if they've been in an outdoor area where they've been getting direct sunlight on a natural schedule, you'll likely need to transition them into your growing space a little bit more slowly. These plants are used to getting 8 to 10, maybe 12 hours of direct sunlight depending on the time of the season. If you suddenly put them into 16 hours of artificial light, again, right about over the top of their leaves, you can burn them. And I've done this. I took plants from the garden to overwinter into my basement, and I put them right up underneath my grow lights, and 3 days later, I had plants with leaves dropping off and burn marks on the remaining leaves. It took me months to get those plants to bounce back, and they never fully recovered enough to really produce much of anything. You'll need to gradually increase the level of light they get from your lighting system. Increase the number of hours by an hour the first 2 days, adding an hour every 2 days until you get them acclimated. And if you get your plants directly from a grower at the farmer's market or a roadside stand, ask them how the plants were treated before they brought them out. Every grower does things differently, and you'll need that information to decide how to properly transition them to your growing situation. Just like an outdoor garden, patience is key to acclimating your plants to your indoor garden. Thanks for joining me on this Focal Point Friday. I'll be back again on Tuesday for another regular episode of the Just Grow Something podcast. So until next time, my gardening friends, keep on cultivating that dream garden, and we'll talk again soon.